All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with our lesson for tonight. Before we get started, we want to start with the memory verse as we normally do. So we are memorizing 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. So if you will go ahead and recite it with me tonight. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. All right, thank you. So, we are, if you remember, we left off with the people of Israel were at Camp Gilgal on the doorstep of Jericho, ready to take the land. And so Joshua here at the end of chapter 5 had been surveying the land and had encountered the commander of the Lord and received assurance of the coming victories, and they are ready now to actually begin the conquest. When we think of the book of Joshua, this is really kind of the section we think about, right? They're out there, they're fighting battle after battle after battle, overthrowing these cities, taking the land. But when you survey the chapters of Jericho as a whole, this is really just a very small section in that book. It's really chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And then there's a lot of chapters after, and there's some chapters before, as this is lesson 4, and we're just now getting to the battles. But there's a lot of other things going on here. I do think that at this point, though, in our study, a lot of times when we think about the battles and they're going out there, and we know war is not a pleasant experience, it can be confusing at times to know why they have to go and they have to kill everybody. They're entering this land and they've been given directions by God to destroy all the people, the men, the women, and the children. And for us, that can stir some emotions within us where there's some conflict at times. Why is this necessary? And before we even start looking at the battles, I wanted to address this question right at the beginning. Why was it necessary to destroy all the inhabitants of the lands? And I gave you some verses, and there's several different reasons as to that were actually given to answer this question. JD?
Well, for me, I think it goes back to God explicitly telling his people, I believe even before they were captive in Egypt, to not intermarry with the other peoples of the world. So by destroying them completely and utterly, it would leave nothing to chance that they could potentially corrupt themselves with the influences of these people whom they are destroying.
Yeah, so there's a very real potential danger of corruption. We know throughout the Bible we see different verses that reference the fact that if we become friends and unequally yoked with those of the world, we run danger of becoming corrupted ourselves and being led astray. You mentioned intermarrying. We see that a problem that comes up throughout the Old Testament, intermarrying with these nations. It's a problem. Okay, so corruption is one of those things. What else do we see?
Simple obedience.
Okay.
God has said, this is what I require of you. This is what they have to do.
Okay. So I was thinking about that. Romans 9 talks about the idea that God chose Jacob over Esau, right? God chooses who he's going to have mercy upon and who he's going to not have mercy upon based on their own actions and how they respond to him, right? If you remember, God gave this promise to Abraham centuries ago, right? And in Genesis 15, God tells Abraham that his descendants will not inherit the land immediately. He's not giving it to Abraham in Abraham's days because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Genesis 15:16. God's going to give them opportunities for repentance and changing their ways. It wasn't time yet to run the people out, to destroy them. Here we are, hundreds of years later, and their wickedness was completed. Their opportunities for repentance were over, and so God was now bringing judgment upon them through the Israelites.
One of the passages that you listed, Exodus 23:33, it's pretty plain. They must not live in your land, or they will cause you to sin against me. Do we believe what God says or not?
Right. That was a promise he gave that, hey, if you do this, there will be problems. As JD mentioned, intermarrying with them and leading them astray over and over, we see that. And that was going to be a problem. And there's one other reason that I have. Stu?
We actually already saw that in action with Balaam and Balak, and it actually says that they had caused the children of Israel to war after these other gods. So they had already seen it in action.
Yeah, at Peor, right? In Numbers 25, I think is what you're referencing here. Yeah, it's been a problem. They saw it in action. They should know it was coming. There's one other reason that I have listed. I'm wondering if y'all caught what I was going for. It's okay if you don't. Okay, Deuteronomy 6, verse 10 and 11. So it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of all good things which you did not fill, hewn-out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, when you have eaten it and are full. So God is giving them an inheritance. This was promised to Abraham, and now he's bringing the people into this land. And if the original inhabitants are here, are they going to let the people come in and live in their houses and eat of the food of their crops? No. God's giving them these things. This is their inheritance, their gift that God is giving them. And so to allow them to have these, to give it to him, they need to remove the people that are currently inhabiting those places. So I want to go through these things that we talked about. One is due to their wickedness. We talked about this map here several weeks ago. We have all these nations that are on the either side of the Jordan, mainly on the west side that they are now inhabiting. The Amorites on the east side they'd already destroyed. All these nations here who are going to be a problem. We talked about the wickedness that they had and the gods that they worshipped. When I referenced this picture several weeks ago, Chris Tarver mentioned that the image of Baal here looks like a modern-day mythological creature. Maybe you've seen this person before. He's not wrong, and I was very glad that I saw a picture of the elf actually in the same pose, which I thought was pretty cool. Chris?
Both are obviously evil too.
They are. They are. Always watching. Always scary and creepy. I did find this other picture of Baal here, which isn't too terribly better, but I like that it has the horns here. Baal is supposed to be referenced by a bull. That was supposed to be one of his images. He's a storm god, and so there's a lot of things going on there. We talked about their places of worship here. This is at Gezer, which was the high places and the really horrific things, the prostitution, the divination and sorcery and snake worship and bestiality and human sacrifices, and all the things that they did when they worshiped. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. But that's just their worship. And their lives are full of really terrible things. These are warrior people. They're brutal, carnal, violent people that are living in these nations and in this land. And God is judging them for their wickedness, and these are just some instances of the wickedness. It should not be confused, though, that they're not being brought in and destroyed because of the righteousness of the Israelites. And that's mentioned in Deuteronomy 9 in verse 4 and 5. Do not think in your heart after the Lord your God has cast them out before you, saying, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. First and foremost, the wickedness of the people resulted in their own dispossession of the land. Yes, there were other reasons, but the people had rejected God after sending prophets. We see instances of God dealing with these nations. Melchizedek being a perfect example of that in the days of Genesis, in the days of Abraham. They had opportunity to reject God, and so that became a problem.
I think, was it last week or maybe the week before also when we talked about Rahab and Jericho, how if there had been other people like Rahab in the whole city of Jericho, God would have, made a way for them to be spared, but evidently there weren't that many good ones left in Jericho. And I think you can kind of extrapolate that concept to the whole land of Canaan.
Yeah. We don't read of anybody else being saved throughout all of the conquests, right? There were instances of like the Gibeonites where they deceived the Israelites, and so they were spared. That wasn't because of their own righteousness. It's the same situation that happened at Sodom and Gomorrah in those cities in the valleys, right? Lot was there. We read in 2 Peter that he was righteous and he was preaching. The people didn't heed that, and so they were destroyed because of it. Yeah, great point. Then we talked about negatively influencing the people. It's a problem that Richard and JD both brought up, and we see that play out in the days of the judges and the kings. This is an image from the city of Dan in the far north. We read in Judges 18 where the tribe of Dan, which was originally settled along the coast of the Mediterranean, just north of the Philistines, they abandoned their land, their inheritance, because they believed they could not overthrow the Philistines. And they moved to the far north and established the city of Dan. In the days of Jeroboam, if you recall, in 1 Kings 12, split off and said, we're going to worship at Bethel and at Dan in the north, lest our people go down and worship in Jerusalem where they're supposed to. He wanted to keep the people that he had divided away from the nation to himself. And so he established this altar. This is the actual altar that Jeroboam established in the north of Dan. It has a large altar, and that's in the center of this picture, marked by these rods. This is a closer image, and these are stairs that are leading up to worship that altar right here so they could sacrifice on this. These were really terrible things that they were doing in these days of the kings. And it started because they failed to push the people out in the end of Joshua and in the days of the judges. This is what's believed to be a house where their priests lived, and they encouraged these really terrible things as they worshiped Baal and all the things that came along with that. Bethlehem.
I just had a question, because I know, like, in the scripture it talks about, like, he condemned them for all their evil acts, but are they spelled out in the Bible, or is there, what resources are you using to find, like, what specific things they were doing?
So there's a lot of archaeological evidence about what their worship of their gods entailed. They wrote some of that down. We have evidence of human sacrifice. There's a pit somewhere in the Holy Lands, I don't remember exactly where, that's just it's at a high place, and it's just full of human remains that are being worshipped and things like that. When they excavated this site, they found a lot of really terrible things as well at this site too that were mentioned. There are places where it's described out. The worship of Molech, I believe, talking about them having their children sending through the fires of Molech in terms of human sacrifices, things like that. So yes, you talk about them encountering prostitution at some of these religious sites. That's mentioned in several places in the Old Testament. So yeah, there's a lot, but also we have a lot of archaeological evidence too. Yeah, great question. Anybody else have comments or questions about any of these things so far? Richard?
I think it's interesting that when God executed judgment on Canaan with Israel, Israel was supposed to clear the land out. And then through Israel's disobedience, they were judged by Syria and Babylon. And God allowed a remnant of his people to come back. They weren't completely destroyed. There's a contrast there that I always thought was interesting.
Yeah, God's always willing to save those who are willing to come to him. Absolutely. Even if that number seems small. And you think about all the people that were destroyed in those battles, and then the destruction by Assyria and the exile of Babylon, and this relatively small number who were faithful to him. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. And then we talked also about the providing of the inheritance, the land, and the various things that they received with that land, and the cities and those sorts of things. So let's talk about Jericho itself. This is going to be the first city that they are going to capture at this point. if we talked about this map, Jericho is here between 6 and 7 miles west of the Jordan River where they crossed over. And we talked about how that water was backed all the way up north of this map when the people crossed over. And now they are camped at Gilgal here, a couple of miles to the east, within eyesight of Jericho. At the end of chapter 5, we talked about Joshua standing on the edge of the camp surveying the city. And if Joshua can see the city can see Joshua and the other Israelites. And we're talking about 1 million plus people out there just scattered along these plains. Their tents, their campfires, all kinds of different things. And those people are sitting on those walls, looking out their windows at this impending doom that's coming to them. This is Tel Es Sultan, right here in the center of this map. This is the site of ancient Jericho, right here. And this is a modern city around it. Jericho was not that large. It was about 7 to 10 acres in size, but it is the first one. We talked, if you'll recall in our first lesson, the geography of the land and how we had the hill country, and then it dropped down into the Jordan Valley. And so this is Jordan Valley here, and this you see less than a mile distance from the city is where that hill country rises up and starts to come up. So this is literally the first city that they're going to encounter as they cross the Jordan. And it's going to be an obstacle that needs to be cleared before they can move up into the hill country and capture some of those cities up there, like Ai and Bethel, and some of the other cities they're going to encounter. It wasn't that large, but it was, by all intents and purposes, a relatively modern city for the time. It is believed, based on archaeological evidence, that the people all lived within the city itself, and they moved out of the city to farm and move livestock and different things like that. But they all lived within the city itself, rather than living around the city and then coming in when danger was there. There were rampart fortifications that led up to the walls. There was a palace. There was an urban center located within the city that has been found and excavated. And so while it's smaller than a lot of the other cities that they're going to encounter later on, that didn't mean it was any less of an obstacle than anywhere else. Remember, we've been talking about the type of people that the Israelites were. They were nomadic. They weren't warriors. The people that lived inside this wall were warriors and craftsmen and farmers and all kinds of different people, but their city was strong. It had a very strong defensive wall to keep out aggressors. This is what's believed to be the steps of a palace here along an edge of a wall of the palace. These are some of the walls that were excavated that are similar to the ones that the people of Israel would have encountered. And so these are, if you're marching along the base of this, and this is up high, you remember Rahab lived up against the wall and then led people out down the wall. So this is a relatively high wall that they're going to be encountering. And so these are things that they're going to have to overcome and conquer. Okay. Let's go ahead and start reading in Joshua 6. And we're going to read the first 14 verses, rather. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all you men of war, and you shall go all around the city once. This you shall do for 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. And the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, when they make a long blast of the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before them." Then Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Proceed and march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the ark of the Lord." So it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, that the 7 priests, bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the Lord, advanced and blew the trumpets. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while the priests continually blowing the trumpets. Now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, You shall not shout or make any noise with your mouth, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I say to you, Shout, and then you shall shout. So he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once. And they came back to the camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. Then the 7 priests, bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord, went on continually and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, but the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the priests continually blowing the trumpets. And the second day they marched around and the city once. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. So they did 6 days. So Jericho here is shut up, right? People had stopped going in and out of the city. We talked about how the people moved out of the city in order to conduct their business and do a number of things. This map, let's go back to this map. You'll see Jericho is located along this main road that led north and south, but also along the roads that led up into the hill country. So this was a trade route that they lived on as well. All that was done. People were in the city, and their doors were shut, the gates were shut, and there was no going in or going out. Taking such a city at the time would have involved a really lengthy siege by military standards, right? They would have had to camp outside and surround it and pretty much wait the people out until they could be starved out or they ran out of water. But the city would have been prepared for that. They had a defensive wall. They had a plan in place for it. And so really, it wasn't logical for the Israelites here to come up and actually take this city. God gave them instructions. And what were the instructions? Who can summarize that? JD?
For 6 days, they were to march around one lap around the entire wall, the only sound being the falling of their feet and the ram's horns. But on the 7th day, after they make 7 laps, not only with the ram's horns, everyone is to shout with a great shout, and the walls are dust, essentially.
So, yes, so they're going to march around the city, 7 to 10 acres rather here, march around the city itself one time, and then go back to the east and relodge at their camp. What's the order that they have to go in? God gives them a very specific order that they have to march in. What's to be at the central piece of this march? The Ark of the Covenant. What's that symbolize? God is leading his people, right? What goes before the ark? Okay, the armed men. So the armed men's going to be in front, followed by priests. What are they going to be doing? Blowing horns. Then the ark, and then a rear guard behind. And they're going to form a circle and lap this city and then go back to camp, right? Put yourself in the place of the people of Jericho during that initial 6 days. How do you think you would feel? You've witnessed the people crossing the river. You've witnessed them camped out for a couple of weeks. You don't know what's going on out there, but you know we know today that the people were being circumcised, and they observed the Passover, and they healed up from that. It's been a couple of weeks. You're not sure what's going on, but the city's been shut up. And how are you feeling in that moment as you see this or this army advance towards you?
If I were in their position, given their reputation of how mighty their God is, I would sure to believe that we're dead, we're doomed, and that if it weren't for this embargo, if we were lucky, maybe we could get halfway across the continent before they destroyed us.
Okay, so fear, right? Paralyzing fear.
Plus, if you think about it, because you said it was at least 7 to 10 acres long, that's probably got to be at least a couple miles, so they would definitely feel exhausted after walking that way. And
Well,
the 7th day, it's like, thank goodness, we're going to shout, and all the walls are just going to fall like that.
Well, that's maybe how the Israelites felt. How did the people in Jericho feel?
They were probably really nervous, like, is this going to work, or are we going to have to walk
Okay?
There was fear because in verse 1 it actually said they shut it because of the children of Israel. So that tells you they had that fear.
Yeah.
These Israelites around here, you see them, no one comes in, no one goes out. So there was totally fear.
Yep. Yes. Let's spin the question a little bit differently. Day 1, people come around, they march, you don't have a clue what's happening, but they're blowing this horn and it's terrifying and they're scared. Verse 1. Then they go back to camp. Day 2, they march up, they're blowing their horns, and they turn around and they go back to camp. Day 3, they march up, blow their horns, walk around, go back to camp. What do you think the state of the people in Jericho was day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6? What's that?
From what we were hearing, they do it to the rest of the people.
Yeah. Okay, Bethlehem, what were you saying?
I just said, like, maybe they're, like, confused. I can imagine, like, knowing the stories of God and, like you said, the walls were shut up. I would be thinking, like, how ominous this all feels when there's this nation just walking around and they sound these trumpets and it's just like, I don't know, it almost gives me like this creepy sense because it's like almost like they're calling their God to come to it. I'm looking through their lens, like, oh, they're calling their God to come take care of us. You know, it gives me kind of a creepy feeling to think of what it must be like to be them.
Yeah, and we talked about the ark being in the center, right? 9 times in these verses we read, 10 times throughout the chapter, the ark is mentioned. It's the key point. The people in Jericho didn't necessarily know what it was, but they would have recognized an object of religious symbolicness, right? So from their point to your point, thinking it was an idol or some manifestation or physical representation of God, that definitely would have been on their thought. Yes?
Also, towards the end of the 7 days, I would imagine they'd also be psychologically exhausted, and probably physically, because of the fear and the dread. You're on edge for days. You're probably not sleeping, probably not eating well, and by the end of it, when they're busy marching around 7 times, oh no, what are we doing now? So
Every morning they're getting up and they're coming around. Is today the day? Not quite. But to your point, is this a military strategy that any of them had seen up to this point? No, it's not. The confusion. Yes, Joanna?
I think that we're viewing this through the lens of God-fearing people, that we know the stories of God and we fear God. These were wicked people. By day 3, this was funny. This
Yes.
was weird and stupid. These weird, bizarro slaves came out of Egypt, and now they're just marching around and walking off. What are they doing?
Right.
I can see their hubris coming into it. Now, yes, fear of the unknown, and anyone who had any sense of them going, this is not going to be good for us. But I think their wickedness would have shown through in that moment too.
My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor your ways my ways, said the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. To your point, the people of Jericho, confusion, what is happening, day 5, day 6, here they come again, is today the day? Nope, they're walking off. Who knows what they're doing at this point, right? God's ways, his plans, don't have to make sense to us. We just have to trust in them and obey them, right? If the people of Israel had failed to blow horns, they are given instruction not to even say a word while they're walking around. All they're doing is blowing their horns. If they had failed to follow God's plan here, is there any reason to think this city would have been given to them? No. We have to trust in God's way. Wait.
Joanne's point. I mean, there was a underground river or spring in the middle of the city, and they had just had their harvest. So I would feel like they were pretty confident in their supplies, and they were very confident in their fortifications. So they probably didn't think much of it than it just being a spectacle outside their city. And it's probably one of the reasons God chose them, because of how the defenses were built up. For that to happen to that city, no one would have believed it, right? So that was the first example that God used for the rest of the nation. But I don't think the Canaanites probably would have thought too much about it, really. I think they were pretty confident that nothing was going to happen.
Yeah, there's definitely an element here where I agree. I think at a certain point, some of that that fear would have worn off. Not enough to go outside the city, but certainly enough to be, here they come. What are they going to do anything different? They're not doing anything different. We're still here today. In the same way that sometimes we can grow complacent. We see things happen. People get sick. Oh, it's not me. People die. Oh, it's not me. I'm still here. And we can grow complacent and not really take heed and think of our own mortality and our own place before God in the way that we should. Right? This was a sign to the people here. Your doom is coming. They should have read the signs. They read it up to a certain point. Did they continue to read throughout the battles? We don't know that, right? And that's kind of my point in this question. Let's think about how they might have felt so that we can contemplate on our own place, right? And how we would encounter something like this. Anybody else? Okay. Talked about the military strategy here wasn't really something that had been encountered either by Israel or by Jericho, right? The concept of people walking around and taking the city just by walking around it and blowing horns is foolish, right? According to wisdom of man. And then the idea of who these people were, former slaves, nomads, taking a warrior city that's well fortified and well stocked and well watered, is again just foolishness. How much faith would it take for the people to do this for 6 days, to do the same thing? They get up in the morning, they go walk around, they blow their horns, and then they come back. They get up the next morning and do the same thing again, and they do that for 6 days. The faith that it would have taken to just get up and trust the process and have faith in God in order to continue and get up and do the same thing day in and day out for 6 days would have been a lot. Would we have the faith to get up and continue to do that same thing every day? It's clear from the strategy that's given here that the battle, it belongs to who? God. No one else was going to be responsible for that.
We're back in Joshua chapter 2. It was when Rahab made the decision that came to spy, you can see that they had the knowledge that this land was already given to these people. So, reading chapter 6, you can see why when they saw them, they started shutting the city down. Because it's like they know the Lord gave them the land, but it's like, I don't think I will let them take the land. But they don't know by what means, how they will take that. So, but like I said, you can see when you read verse 8 in chapter 2, you can see Rahab was already telling them, I know the Lord gave you all that land.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the responses, and we talked about this last week, I think, the different responses of faith here. Rahab had faith and belief that God was going to give them that land, and she responded in kind, sought him, and received her salvation. The people here had seen the signs, had faith that that was some way the Lord was bringing the army against them to take the land too. But they responded by shutting themselves up in the city. We see other instances over the next several chapters where people battle and they fight and they do everything they can to keep that from happening. God's plans and promises can't be thwarted, regardless of what our response is to it. His promises come true every single time. We need to be careful to trust and respond appropriately so we are receiving the promises rather than being rejected, as was the case here. Yeah, great point. Okay, we got Hugh.
One would think that after 2 generations of wandering and probably hearing some remorse in their fathers,
Yep.
and having seen the things that they had seen in the crossing of the Jordan, that there should have been a little different mindset than before.
Yes, and we talked, I think we skirted over that a little bit in chapter 4. The response of the people to the crossing, in verse 14, on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. They saw that sign. They recognized it as God is with Joshua, and they were willing to follow and respect God's word being communicated through Joshua here to help them take this land. As we'll read next week, not everybody. There were still some temptations and some stumblings, right? But for the most part, everybody's on board. Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and finish out the chapter here. Let's pick it up in verse 15. And it came to pass on the seventh day that they rose early, about the dawning of the day, and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day, only they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the horns, that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you by all means shall abstain from the accursed things, lest ye become accursed, when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel accursed, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord, and they shall come into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the shout of the trumpet, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted the great shout, that the walls fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. But Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the country, "Go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her." And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua charged them at the time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds this city Jericho. He shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country. So they get up on the 7th day, and now they are going to have the city on this day. They have to march 7 times around. They now have to make a noise. They have to shout at the blowing of the trumpet after the 7th time, and the walls were come down flat. Why did the walls of Jericho fall? Faith. Yep. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down because they were encircled for 7 days. Have anything to do with the people? No, not by their power, but they had to obey. They had to obey in faith. If they failed to do that, those walls weren't going to fall down flat. But they fell because of God's power. The military strategy had nothing to do with man. They just had to get up and obey. And so God gave them that. What warnings were given to the people before the fall of the city?
Do not partake of any of the accursed things, lest you be cursed by them.
Why? What was to be done with the city?
Utterly destroyed, except for the gold, silver, iron, bronze.
Yep. The city shall be doomed to the Lord to destruction. Who is a different word here instead of doomed? Devoted. Okay. I think that is a better word than doomed. The word here indicates that Jericho was the first fruits of the land. Okay, we read throughout Exodus 34:26, "The first of the first fruits of your land shall belong to the house of the Lord your God." Proverbs 3:9, "Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase." The idea here is that we don't give God our leftovers. We give him our first, our best. This was going to be the first thing they encounter and they take. The first possession they get. And God is claiming it as his own. It belonged to him. It was his battle, his victory. The city belonged to him. And it was to be devoted to him. That is why when we get into chapter 7, Achan's sin is so egregious. Because he stole from the Lord. Right? God here selected Jericho as the first fruit of the land, the first thing that was to be given. And so it belonged to him to do with as he saw fit. Yes, it was going to be devoted to him and destroyed, but that is what God chose for it. And so the people didn't have any selection into going in and saving something or arguing about it. God here had made a decision. It's hard for us sometimes to wrap our heads around devoting something to God and having it being destroyed. But that's exactly what God was calling for. It was to be sacrificed. It was to be given to him as a gift. And disobedience would result in being cursed. Okay? And then what was the other thing they were supposed to do? The other instruction they were given here. Concerning Rahab. She needed to be saved, right? Out of all the things that were supposed to be destroyed, Rahab and her people were the only things that were supposed to be saved. Why was Rahab being saved? By her faith. Hebrews 11. By faith, the city walls fell. By faith, Rahab was saved. Did she play a role in that? Yes. She was given instructions. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. She had to hang that specific scarlet cord out the window. She had to bring her people into her household. No one had to leave. She needed to keep it quiet. Tell no one that this was coming. She obeyed in faith. But that didn't mean that she saved herself. Right? God saved her from destruction here because of her faith. And so that was very, very key. As JD mentioned, abstain from the accursed things was that. What were the accursed things? Their idols. Okay. What else? Everything. Their idols, but specifically everything. Everything in this city belonged to God. And God marked it. So the spoils of Jericho, God marked it as being either something he wanted saved or something that he wanted destroyed. What was to be saved in addition to Rahab?
The gold, the silver, and the vessels of bronze and iron. It's basically the true spoils of war, the valuable things.
And those were to be given to the house of the Lord, not to the people. They belonged to God. And he was, as first fruits, he was claiming them as his own. And then everything else had to be destroyed, with the exception of Rahab and what was inside Rahab's house. Okay. What warnings were given to Joshua about rebuilding Jericho here? I've highlighted them for us on this verse. You're going to lay the foundation with the firstborn, and the youngest will be laid with the gates when the gates are constructed. This came to pass, okay, in 1 Kings 16. In the days of Ahab, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho, and he laid his foundations with his firstborn, and with his youngest he set up his gates, exactly as Joshua prophesied. This was a promise that was fulfilled, okay? Joshua marked it. This city is accursed. It belongs to God. No one should rebuild it. Someone rebuilt it. And unfortunately, the things Joshua promised here came to pass. What are some of the other promises we see fulfilled here at Jericho? See?
Well, he told them that the wall would come down if they followed the instructions, and it did, and also that he would drive out there before him, which he did.
Mm-hmm. So the promises he gave on the other side of the river, that no man would be able to stand against them, came to pass here. Okay? What else? What was the promise he gave to Joshua?
Giving Jericho to your hand.
Give him Jericho to his name, and he did. He was also promised that he was going to elevate Joshua, right? So that all the nations would fear him. And we see that described here exactly in verse 27 here. His fame spread throughout all the country. Not to Joshua's credit. All credit was being given to God. But Joshua was a military leader. And we see that's going to come in handy later as they're conquering the lands. This fame that Joshua is receiving was going to cause fear throughout the people. And they were going to respond in different ways. But all of them would lead them into destruction at the hands of the Lord. JD.
To your point, I don't think it was just fame, but also infamy as well among the people of Canaan. The people of Canaan, fame to the Israelites, and infamy, a reason to fear him and the God he serves by literally
Yep, and it led all of them to respond poorly and to seek their own destructions. Okay, next week we will continue with the situation at Ai. Thank y'all.